Okay, so welcome to my Reading and Altering Sewing Patterns class. My name is Mila. So in this class, we are going to be going over how to read a commercially produced sewing pattern. This is a beginner-friendly class, so if you have sewn some patterns before, I'll likely be touching on some topics that you may already know a little bit about, especially in the first half, but hopefully there will be something new for you to learn as well. If you have a pattern at home, you are invited to follow along. But if not, I do have plenty of photos. There'll be no shortage there. Now, sewing patterns do have a lot of different symbols and a lot of terms, and that can be kind of overwhelming if you're approaching this as a new sewist. So we're going to be going through what you need to know to complete a project, start to finish, and after that, we're going to touch on some techniques to resize or otherwise alter your patterns so they fit you a little bit better. I'm just going to open up chat here. So if you have any questions, I can see them. Here we go. Okay. So let's get started. Perfect. So to start, we're going to take a look at the envelope and what information can be gleaned from that. There's usually a lot of information and it's really tightly packed. And to make things more confusing, every company does things a little bit differently. So I have a couple of different samples for us to look at from some of the bigger companies. So we've got Berta, we've got Butterick, we've got McCall's, we've got Simplicity, and we've got Vogue. So that's a lot to look at, a lot of information there. So we're going to break that all down so you know what exactly you're looking at and where to find the information that you need. So the first thing to look at now, what size are you making? So we're going to be going into some more specific details on how to measure yourself and adjust your fit to size a little bit later on. But to start, we're just going to look at where to find the sizing information. Most pattern companies have a size chart on the envelope flap, like so. So again, we've got Butterick, McCall's, and Vogue here. Simplicity likes to nest their charts in the middle, kind of between all the rest of their information on the back of the envelope there. But if you still can't find your size chart, it might actually be on the pattern paper itself, like Berta tends to do. So let's just take a quick look at the chart itself. So most size charts are going to be some variation on this. You've got your three basic measurements, your chest or bust, you've got your waist, and the hip or seat. Some patterns might be more specific about where your hip lies. It might say specifically 7 or 9 inches below the waist. They may even ask for additional measurements. But for the most part, these are your main three. These are the ones that we're going to be worrying about. The corresponding size is either going to be along the top here, like this one is. Sometimes it's along the bottom. Now, all of these charts are in inches. The metric's usually nearby, usually right below or on the opposite side of the envelope with the language translations. And just a heads up, I'm probably going to be defaulting entirely to imperial measurements because that is what I use at my job. Now, when you are checking your size charts here, it's important to double check sizing between different pattern companies because they might vary a little bit and they almost definitely will not be the same as whatever size clothing you would usually buy for yourself. So if you usually buy size 14 dresses, for example, you might find that you are actually a 16 or even an 18 in sewing pattern sizes. So just double check those measurements to make sure you're looking at the right one. Now, let's say you've taken your measurements now and you find that you're just not quite lining up perfectly with one of these columns, and that's perfectly normal. If let's say your bust is a 45, you're between these two, but your waist is a 36, your hip's a 47. You're kind of running between three different sizes here. Personally, I would err on the side of caution. Pick the larger size to cut out here. You're probably going to have an easier time taking fabric out than you are taking fabric in. You're have an easier time taking in a seam, taking fabric out than you are going to have trying to add fabric in. And when we get to alterations, it's a little easier to grade down. So we'll be talking about that later on. Now, not all pattern envelopes contain every size. Most are going to contain a range of sizes, or even less commonly, a single size. So when you are purchasing your pattern, just double check that you are buying the right size. So taking your measurements, you've checked the size chart, and you found the size you intend to cut out, just take a quick look at the front of that envelope and see what size it contains. So it's usually along the top here. So Berta, we've got European and US sizes notated here. Butterick, just above the barcode in the brackets, 46 to 52, and Simplicity is just nested in between, in the middle here, just right along the top. Now, if it's not along the top, it might be on the side of your envelope here. So same thing as Butterick, you've got the sizes in brackets along the side, or it might even be hiding down at the bottom here. At Vogue, you've got the 12, 14, 16 just above the barcode in the bottom corner there. So now you know what size you need. You've double checked you've got the right pattern. We can start looking at fabrics. So the back of your envelope is going to have some fabric recommendations for you. It's usually found near the top of the envelope in a little block of text just above the yardage charts, which we'll talk about in a moment. So I've cropped out the right half of the envelopes, which is the language translation. So we're just looking at the English sides here. So right at the top of the envelope, just beneath your garment description, so we've got a description here, you have your recommended fabrics. So this is Butterick and McCall's. Bird is a little different. They've got a nice little drawing here of a fabric bolt to indicate what your recommended fabrics are. But most are going to look like these two, like Butterick and McCall's. Simplicity and Vogue here. So Simplicity doesn't have that garment description just right at the top. You've got your fabrics. Vogue, you've got your description and your fabrics down here. When you've got a big wall of text like this, the fabric suggestions are going to be in bold text. It'll say fabric or fabric suggestions in that bold text just so it pops out a little bit more so it doesn't get lost in all that text. Now, recommended fabrics are just that. They are recommended. You are not bound by these listed fabrics. They're just going to give you an idea of what kind of weight will best suit the garment. Weight of fabric. Is it a heavy woven fabric, something very stiff, or is it something light with a lot of movement? It's also going to give you an indication of the kind of stretch that your fabric is expected to have. So you can absolutely change it up. Just be aware that if you change something too drastically without understanding why that specific type of fabric was recommended, you might end up creating some problems for yourself a little later on. So for instance, if a pattern is calling for a very stretchy knit or even a spandex, and you want to swap that out with this really nice woven cotton that you have, the stretches aren't anything alike. You might find that now you can't even get this garment on because this pattern was relying on the stretchiness of that knit to be able to stretch around your head or to stretch around your body measurements to get a tight fit. Skin tight patterns like bodysuits, the pattern pieces are actually cut out smaller than your body measurements for this exact reason. They're relying on the stretch of the fabric to get that skin tight fit. This works the other way around as well. If you are replacing a tight weave with a stretchy knit, now suddenly the zipper that your pattern was calling for isn't necessary, or it's not going to fit as snugly as you were expecting it to be. So just keep those things in mind. You can absolutely change fabrics up, just be aware of the effects that might have. If you're not sure, you can always ask for help, or even just try sticking to something that is similar to what they are recommending. Okay, so you've picked out your fabric. How much are you going to need? So the back of the envelope is always going to have your yardage charts, and that's going to tell you exactly how much fabric you're going to need for what you're making. So Bird is always a little different, but they've got their yardage charts right at the very top. For Butterick and McCall's, they are right below your fabric recommendations. You've got your little charts here and here. Simplicity and Vogue, same thing. Just underneath your fabric recommendations, Simplicity, you've got your fabrics here and their body measurements here. So there is your yardage chart. So we're going to take a closer look at the actual chart itself. There's a couple things you need to know before you can figure out your yardage. So again, these are always generally in inches or yards, and metric measurements will be nearby if you prefer to read those. So the first thing you need to ask yourself is, which pattern view are you making? So if a pattern contains multiple garment pieces or variations, they're all going to be labeled alphabetically. So there's going to be some line art of the different views on the back of the envelope, and it's going to show you more clearly which piece corresponds to which letter. So here, coat is labeled A, and the vest is labeled B. If we were to make coat A, we just need to worry about this top half of this chart. So we've got A labeled here, that's the top half, B labeled down here for the bottom half. So if we're just making A, we're just looking at the top here. So the next thing we need to know is how wide is the fabric that you want to use. Most fabric bolts will come in one of two sizes, 45 inches or 60 inches. So in metric, that's 110 centimeters or 150 centimeters. Most fashion fabrics tend to come in 60 inches. Cottons tend to come in 45. That's more of a general thing. You're going to find fabric coming in all sorts of different types and sizes. Now, we do need to take note of these asterisks here next to your bolt sizes. Now, these asterisks are telling you whether or not the nap of your fabric is going to have an impact on your yardage. So what is a nap? A nap refers to fabrics like velvets or corduroys where the raised fibers have to run a specific direction. So either the fabric's going to be really smooth when pet one direction, but really jagged when pet the other. Or the fabric might change shades when viewed from an opposite direction. You can see this shading effect particularly on velvets. So even if they don't seem to have a single direction that feels softer or nicer, the color might change if you don't cut it in a consistent direction. One direction it might look really dark. If you flip it, it's going to look really light in the other way. For the purposes of cutting out patterns, your fabric would also be considered to have a nap if it has a directional pattern printed on it. So if you've got a nice big floral pattern, you need to make sure that you are cutting out all of those pieces in the same direction to avoid having panels where the flowers are upside down. So for that, if you've got that kind of thing, a big pattern, you would be cutting with the nap measurements. So it's next to your bolt width, you're going to have one of these three asterisk combinations. Most often, you're going to find this third label, so 1/2 or 3 asterisks. And that means that the amount of fabric that you need is unaffected by the nap of your fabric. If you are planning to use a fabric that must be run a specific direction, just keep an eye out for these asterisks. You might need to buy extra fabric, but it will tell you that on your chart. Okay, so we know what view we're making, how wide our fabric is, whether or not the nap is relevant. We can finally check the yardage against our size. So if we are making view A, size 44, with a 60-inch fabric, we are going to need 3.5 yards of fabric. Now this pattern actually calls for a contrast color. Some part of this garment is intended to be sewn in a different color. So this here is going to tell us how much we need. So this here is telling us we need a 1/4 yard of this second fabric, or second color. If you're doing the whole thing in a single color, you can just add that yardage onto your total, giving you a total of 3 3/4. But there's some additional information here. How much yardage you're going to need for a lining. In this case, we are going to need 2 7/8. They are only giving us the yardage for a 45-inch fabric here. So unfortunately, if you are using a 60-inch fabric, you will likely need less than this, but there's no quick way to figure out how much you're going to need instead. It's also giving us some information on interfacing. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the term, this is a type of stiffener that's going to be hidden inside the garment. It's going to give some extra strength and structure to the piece it's attached to. It looks a lot like fabric. So I've got some here. It's just going to look a lot like fabric. Usually it comes in much narrower sizes. So it's usually black or white, it could be woven or non-woven, and there's two main types. There's sew-in and iron-on. Sew-in interfacing is sewn to the edges of your pattern piece, and it's going to move with the fabric. Iron-on has a thin layer of glue that you adhere to the fabric using an iron. And a quick tip for interfacing, if you are using the iron-on, you always want to use a low dry heat. You do not want to bring steam into this equation. If you do, you're just going to end up evaporating your glue away before it can adhere. Now it's a sew-in. This pattern here is specifically calling for sew-in interfacing. In 18 or 20 inches, as I said, it comes in much narrower sizes than fabric does. And regardless of the size you're making, you are going to need 5 3/8 yards for this whole pattern. That is a lot of interfacing for this. Sometimes if a project is requiring interfacing, you might find that listed near or among the suggested fabrics as well. Okay, so looking at this chart, we have now learned that we are going to need 2 different fabrics. we don't have to worry about nap. Nap is not relevant to our cutting here. We know we're going to need a fabric for lining, and we know we are going to need an amount of interfacing. So that's quite a bit of information packed into this tiny little chart here. It's very, very useful. Okay. So the last thing we need to look at before we can crack this pattern open is what kind of notions we are going to need. So notions refer to all those extra bits. So your threads, your buttons, your trims, your clasps, all that extra detail. You may also hear such things referred to as haberdashery, which is the British term for notions. Now your notion list is usually found either below the yardage chart, so here and here, or it might be above, listed near your suggested fabrics. So here on Vogue, we've got it listed just above our suggested fabrics. And again, it's going to be in a bold text to help it stand out from the block of text. Berta doing its own thing again. They've got little illustrations to draw your eye and show you what you need. Now this is going to be a full list of exactly how many buttons you need, what size those buttons should be, zipper length, zipper types, yardages for trims, just all those little extra details. Sometimes it'll list thread, usually not with yardage. But just a reminder, if you are buying fabric for this project, it's usually a good idea to pick up your matching thread at the same time, especially if you are planning on having a lot of top stitching or visible stitching. The thread that you have at home that you're planning on using probably doesn't match as well as you think it will. Okay, I lied to you. There's actually one more thing on the envelope worth noting, and that is the finished measurements chart. Now this is worth noting if you are planning on making alterations, or even if you're just a little unsure of the size that you've chosen to cut out. So these charts are usually the very last thing at the bottom of the envelope here. So these finished measurements are almost never going to be the same as your body measurements for the size that you're making. So right along the bottom. So the finished measurements on this garment are actually a full 3 inches larger than the bust measurement for each size, for the size. So bust for size 6, 30.5, it's finishing at 33.5. Now that's good. You actually want that extra space. So these extra inches make up the garment's wearing ease. So this extra space is built into the pattern and lets you move freely in the finished garment. So if it were to finish skin tight at your exact body measurements, and especially if the fabric has no stretch, it is going to be unwearable. So you need those couple extra inches just to allow you to move without restraint. Typically, the bust gets an extra 2.5 to 3.5 inches. The waist tends to get an extra inch, and the hips get around 2.5, 2 3/4 inches extra. Design ease is excess fabric that is put in deliberately to achieve a specific look. Design and wearing ease. So consider your like a pirate's shirt with the really poofy pirate sleeves. The amount of excess fabric in there goes beyond wearing ease. It is now a stylistic design choice. It is now design ease. Okay, we're going to get to the sewing instructions right after this. I just wanted to make a really quick note about pre-washing your fabrics because it's an important step and most patterns don't talk about it. So before you start cutting into your new fabric, it is recommended that you pre-wash it. Now this is a good idea for a couple of different reasons. So first, if you just purchased this fabric, there might be some residual sizing left in it. Sizing is substances that are added to the fibers to increase fiber strength and reduce abrasion during the manufacturing process. If there's any residual sizing left in the fabric, pre-washing it will take care of that, and it might even soften up your fabric a little bit. Next, sometimes the fabric dye can bleed a little bit on the first wash. So pre-washing the fabric will usually take care of this if it is an issue, and it'll save any clothes you end up washing with your finished garment later on. Now, some fabrics won't bleed at all. Some may never stop bleeding dye, but that is less common. Either way, a pre-wash is going to reduce your risk of dye bleed. Pre-washing is also going to do you the favor of pre-shrinking your fabric. Now, this is more of a thing with natural fibers than synthetic fibers, but the first time you wash your fabric, it may shrink on you a little bit. Now, it might not be a drastic difference. I believe cotton has something like a 5% shrinkage rate on the first wash, and while that may not be enough to change the finished size of your garment, it might end up giving you some puckering at your seams, which if you spent all your time, ironing it all flat and smooth, making nice crisp seams, and you wash it and they end up puckering on you, you're going to be a little disappointed. Now, final note, when pre-treating or pre-washing your fabric, treat it how you intend to treat your garment. So if you are going to be running your garment through the washing machine and dryer at high temperatures, then that is how you should pre-wash your fabric. If you are only ever going to hand wash it and hang to dry, then that is sufficient for your pre-wash. Just make sure that the fabric you intend to use is able to withstand the treatment you intend to give it. So you don't want to end up putting wool in the dryer, for example. Okay, it is time to crack open the instructions. What are you going to find on that first page there? So just like the envelopes, first page of the instructions are all tightly packed with information. They all look a little bit different, but there are constants. So the first thing you're going to see is the line art of your garment in the top left corner, followed by a list of contents. So this list of contents is your list of pattern pieces. It's just an inventory of what is in the envelope. Now, this is helpful because it tells you exactly which pieces you need to cut out for the view that you are making. This is your checklist. The drawing of the pattern pieces also helpful to find the exact pieces that you're looking for when you unfold the paper to cut it all out. You can choose to leave everything else uncut if you want, because you're not going to need them for the project you're working on. Now, this list is going to be written in one of two ways. So either it will be divided evenly for different garments. So here we've got the entire list for all of coat A and the entire list for all of vest B. Or it may be grouped together with notations for variations. So here we've got coat A and B. If we're making coat A, we'll need 1, 2, 3, 4 is flap A, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 is cuff A, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. We are not going to need 17 or 18 flap B and cuff B if we are only making coat A. Okay. Now, there are going to be a lot of cutting layouts on your instructions. So often they might even spill over onto the second page of your instructions. But they're all clearly labeled, so you can find the correct layout for your pattern view, fabric width, and size that you are using. If your pattern calls for interfacing or lining, they're going to have their own illustrations separately. So this first one here is for coat A, 45-inch fabric with or without nap, sizes 38 to 44. Next one is the exact same thing, but for sizes 46 to 52. And then here for the 60-inch fabrics, the two different sizes. Sometimes there may be a separate layout if the nap affects your yardage, so keep an eye out for that. Then it has our sewing interface for all the sizes and widths, and our lining for sizes 38 to 42 and 44 to 52. Then it moves on to view B, so on and so forth. Everything's going to be clearly labeled, so just take a note of that information there and line it up with what you're working with. Now, when you are looking at these drawing layouts, you are going to need to reference this chart. So the illustrations are going to give you information on where exactly everything needs to be. So these shading and dotting are going to help you line things up a little bit easier by indicating when a pattern piece needs to be flipped to fit or when the fabric needs to be opened up. So let's just take a closer look here real quick. So the shading here is telling us that our fabric needs to be folded with the right sides together, and that, the right sides of the fabric, that's the side that's going to be visible from the outside of the garment. This chart has labeled fold and selvages. Sometimes they may just be marked with an S or an F. And if you're unfamiliar with the term selvage, selvage is just the woven ends of the fabric. It's the side that does not get cut when you are measuring out your yardage. So that's just the nice finished side on the edge of the bolt of fabric. Sometimes it may have little perforations along this edge. Now, this layout is clearly showing which pattern pieces go where. And you can see number 5 here. This number 5 here this one needs to be flipped over, so cut with right side up and wrong side out. And the reason these pieces are sticking out like this is because you are meant to unfold the fabric here and cut out this piece in a single thickness rather than fold it over like this in a double thickness like the rest of the pieces on this chart. Sometimes pattern pieces are going to be too big, or there just won't be enough space to cut everything out in a double thickness, so you will need to unfold the fabric and cut each piece out individually. But when that is needed, it will be clear in the illustrations either by sticking out over the edge like this, or with its own chart shaded to indicate a single thickness, like so. Generally, these layout charts are designed with the most efficient fabric usage in mind, but you can absolutely move pieces around as you see fit, especially if you are trying to match a stripe or center a particular motif on your fabric. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground so far. It's finally time to take a look at the pattern paper and the symbols that you are going to find on the pieces themselves. Most patterns will have a key or explanation of the symbols on the first page of your pattern instructions. So if there are any unique symbols that I have overlooked, you should be able to consult your instructions for that information. If you're finding that when you unfold your pattern paper, it's really scrunched up, it's not lying flat, you can iron out those creases. Just use a low heat, go slow, and absolutely no steam. If you steam that paper, it is all over. Okay. So most of your pattern pieces are all going to have some consistent labeling on it. Usually the company name and the pattern number is going to be there in case this paper ever gets separated from its envelope. You'll be able to identify where it belongs. The piece number, as noted on your list of contents, what that piece is. This is a back lining for views A and B. And it's going to tell you how many you need to cut out. So this one we're cutting out 2. So when you're folding your fabric over in half and tracing it, you're going to get your 2 cuts from that. It'll also tell you if you need interfacing in this piece and how many you need to cut out in interfacing. This piece, however, is just cut 2, no interfacing for this piece. So if a pattern contains multiple sizes, each pattern piece is going to have multiple outlines that align with a different size. So a lot of companies will use different patterned lines. So we've got different break patterns in the lines just to make it easier to follow when you're cutting out. Some might just be solid lines. Some companies just use solid lines. In either case, the outlines are going to be frequently notated with the size number to help you keep track. So either they'll be nested in against the lines like this, or they might have the arrows pointing to each line, pointing to the corresponding line. So just to help you keep track of that. Now you can either cut out your pattern paper itself, cut it to the desired size. You can transfer all of your lines onto a separate sheet of pattern paper, cut that out. I even know one person who will cut out all of their patterns at the largest size and then cut slits into the paper so that you can then fold your paper down to trace at a smaller size. And you can keep the larger size, and now you can reference all the sizes on that envelope. All the sizes on that pattern piece by doing that. Okay, so the grain line is one you're going to encounter. So the grain line on the pattern is just going to help you orient the placement of that piece on the fabric. So essentially, you always want these lines to be parallel to your selvage, and the arrows should all be oriented in the same direction. Fabric itself has 3 different grain directions. Grain just refers to the direction of the threads in the fabric. So most of the time, the grain line on your pattern pieces are going to be straight. That means that your pattern piece should be running along the warp threads. So that's these going up and down, parallel to the selvage here. Regardless of if you're using woven or knit, these straight grain lines are going to be parallel to your selvage. You're probably not ever going to encounter a cross grain in your pattern pieces, but just for the sake of interest, a cross grain refers to the threads that run perpendicular to the selvage. So this is your weft yarn. Now you will encounter a bias grain. So these pieces are to be laid at a 45-degree angle across your fabric. So with this piece, your arrow, your grain line, is still going to be parallel to your selvage, but the pattern piece itself is going to be oriented at this angle along the bias of the fabric. And the benefit of this cut is that that fabric piece is actually going to have a lot more stretch to it. That is what bias tape is. So the fabric's been cut on the bias grain, gives it that stretch that it needs to go around curved seams without bunching. Okay, Next is the fold line. Now this just indicates that this piece needs to be placed at the edge of your fabric where it has been folded over, so that when you cut this piece out, it will unfold into one large piece. There's no need to add seam allowance here. You never need to cut this edge. You just need to make sure that you don't accidentally place it on the wrong edge of your fabric and you wind up with two half pieces that are too small to sew together. So you're going to put it on the fold, and when it's cut out, you're going to end up with one big piece. Okay, notches and other markings. So triangular notches and dots are two of the more common forms of markings. You may see the triangles inverted, so they protrude out from the pattern lines, but the function is the same. These notches are going to help you line up your fabric when you are sewing the pieces together. This is helpful when you are sewing around curves, or if one layer requires gathering or pleats. Matching these notches up is just going to ensure that everything is lining up where it is meant to be. It's going to help you keep an eye out to see if one layer of your fabric is stretching more than the other, for example. Something that I learned recently is that it is not uncommon for single notches to be used for the front of a garment and double notches to be used on the back, which is very helpful when you are sewing in sleeves, because there isn't really any other indicator that you might be sewing in a sleeve backwards. So transferring these notches onto your fabric can be really beneficial. Dots can mean a couple different things. They can be used as marks to line up your fabric, similar to the notches, but they can also be an indicator of where to stop sewing, where to pivot your needle when going around corners, or where eyelets are to be installed. If it's something specific like a stopping point, it's going to be labeled as such on the pattern paper. Places where buttons are to be attached are indicated with an X. Placement may vary depending on size. You can see that here. Buttonholes are going to be marked with these straight lines with these little capped ends. They are going to be marked at the length that they will need to be sewn at. Sometimes you're going to see both symbols combined, and your buttonholes may even be on an entirely separate pattern piece that doesn't get cut out, but is instead just a reference guide that you can lay over your fabric later to transfer the markings when you are ready to sew them in. Now, darts are used to add shaping to your garment. There are two types that you're likely to encounter. You've got these long diamond ones, and they are going to add a gentle curve to your garment. I often find these on the front or back of fitted jackets, and it just tucks the fabric in a little bit, so it just curves in a little closer to the body. These triangular darts are going to give you more dramatic reshaping. It's common to see them used around the torso, the bust, the shoulders, the waist, because it's able to tuck in more fabric and create a more drastic shape change. Now the diamond one especially looks a little wild until you isolate the size you're sewing. So I've highlighted just one here. It still looks pretty busy, but when you transfer your markings over, you're just going to have the one, and that is a lot more manageable to look at. So indicators is next. I couldn't actually find a single name that refers to these marks as a whole, these little circles with crosses in them. They might be referred to as bust or hip indicators or bust or hip apex points. I'm calling them indicators or measurement points. Just know that those are not the official names for the symbol. I couldn't find what they're actually called. Now these measurement points are going to be helpful with fitting your garment, as they indicate different points where the garment should be sitting and where the apex points of the garment are. So this waistline mark is showing you where your waist is intended to sit when you are wearing the garment. So if you are taller or shorter than the person this pattern was modeled after, then this marking is going to help you figure out how much you need to add or subtract to your length to get a better fit, to get that waist mark to sit where your waist is on your body. Now this mark, this one in particular that I've taken a picture of, is a bust apex. So not only is it indicating where the apex of your bust should sit on the garment, that's the widest part around the bust. It may also include your finished measurements for the circumference of the garment at this point. Now this does include your wearing and design ease as well. So if you are going to be making adjustments to your bust measurement, this is the point that it needs to align with. This is the widest part of the bust. So you're going to find similar markings at the hip, and you may sometimes even find them on a sleeve marking your bicep. Now, a lot of these markings are going to need to be transferred to your fabric, which is why the pattern layouts want you to cut your pieces out with the wrong side of the fabric facing out. This is so you can mark it up without risk of your marks being visible on the finished garment. There's a lot of ways you can do this. It's entirely up to personal preference. Personally, I like to use just chalkboard chalk that I've sharpened. White chalk specifically, if you're using chalkboard chalk, a lot of the colored chalk doesn't brush out as easily and it may stain your fabric. You can buy tailor's chalk. It's a little waxy, so it will stick to the fabric better and it should just wash right out. And it usually comes in multiple colors. There's carbon paper and tracing wheel. Classic. Most sewing kits will come with a tracing wheel. Washable fabric markers are good. I'm seeing them more and more. But you will need to always test those markers on your fabric just to make sure that it will wash out cleanly and it's not going to stain. Somewhat more time consuming is transferring your marks over by sewing them on with a contrast thread using long running stitches or tailor's tacks. Now the benefit of this method is that it's more durable. It's not going to brush out when you're moving your fabric around. It's sometimes more visible and it can be a little more precise. When you're done, you can just pull the thread out, leaves no marks, no residue to wash out. Okay, we have arrived. It is time to talk about some ways that you can make changes to a commercial pattern so that they can fit you just a little bit better. Before you know what alterations need to be made, you need to have accurate measurements to refer to. So I've written up a small tutorial on different measurements you may need and how to most accurately get those measurements. I will drop the file in the Adventure Academy event page when this class is done. But again, these are your main 3 bust, waist, hips. And the main thing to keep an eye on is making sure that your measuring tape is parallel to the ground when you are measuring the circumference around the body. And make sure that you are measuring at the fullest point of the bust and hips. Now, after you get these measurements, remember to add in your wearing ease. Otherwise, your garment will be too small. So that is approximately an extra 3 inches around the bust, inch around the waist, about 2.5 inches around the hips, give or take, depending on your fabric and also just what you're comfortable wearing. Particularly thick fabrics, like gambersons, you are going to need extra wearing ease, an extra inch or 2. And I know that sounds like a lot, but just remember that it is way easier to take a seam in when it is too large than it is to fix when it is too small. Now, most patterns are modeled after an individual who is around 5'6" for women's patterns or 5'10" for men. If you are not either of those heights, you are going to have to make some adjustments. Now, these solid double lines here are indicators of where it is safe to add or subtract length to your pattern pieces. So you can either cut the piece here, spread it out, use a ruler to even out the lines along the side, or you can fold here to shorten your pattern. So measure the length of your pattern piece and refer back to your own measurements to figure out how much you may need to add or subtract. If there are multiple of these lines on a single pattern piece, then you can spread out your size changes across these points, add more in one spot, less in another to customize your fit a little more. Now, when you're doing your calculations to figure out how much you need to add or subtract, personally, I find it is helpful to think of your pattern in terms of finished size versus your cut size. So your finished size is just what it sounds like. When the garment is all sewn up, that is the length it will be. You can then add on to that measurement your extra inches for pleats, for darts, for whatever additional stylistic thing you want to add, as well as your seam allowance to get your cut size. Now, I find I am less likely to accidentally cut something too short if I'm measuring it in these 2 different ways. I'm inventorying what additional inches are required. Just make sure that when you do these changes, you add the changes to the corresponding piece. So if you've lengthened the front half of the pants, you want to do those same length things to the back half of the pants on the right and left sides. Okay, so let's talk about seam allowance here. Most patterns will have a seam allowance included, generally not marked out on the pattern piece. It should say on the first or second page of the instructions. It may be written on the pattern paper itself what the seam allowance is. It's usually 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters. You're going to need to know what that seam allowance is if you are making more drastic alterations and you need to calculate out your cut size versus your finish size. As well, if you're sewing at a seam allowance that is different from what has been built into the pattern, that is going to have an impact on your finished measurements. I prefer to sew at a 1/2 inch So these patterns that are cut out at a 5/8 of an inch, I sometimes will end up with an additional inch in my measurements if I'm sewing across enough seams. So you're going to see an impact there on your finished measurement if you are sewing at a different seam allowance than what the pattern has allowed for. Okay, so let's talk about some ways to make adjustments. So an easy way to customize your fit is blending between sizes. So if your measurements fall into different sizes, then these lines are actually going to be helpful in making your adjustments. So find your bust, your waist, and your hip indicators and highlight which size corresponds to your measurements at those points. You can then draw new lines connecting between those 2 points. You're going to want to try to mimic the existing curve of the pattern as much as possible, and a curved ruler is really going to help you get smooth lines. They're an excellent patterning tool, and I highly recommend picking one up. You might even be able to find a printable file for a curved ruler online if you want to check that out. So here is my hypothetical bust line on this pattern piece, and we've tapered down at the bust point from the largest size down 2 sizes to the waist. Your lines are going to be smoother than mine because I drew this in MS Paint. Now, when you're making these changes, just remember that you need to make the same adjustments to the pieces that it will be attaching to. So in this case, we altered the front panel. We need to do the same to the back. And the same idea applies if you need to extend your pattern piece out from the largest size at a single point. So calculate where you need it to go. If you want to add an extra 1/2 inch to this pattern piece, you're just going to mark where that is at the apex point, and then you're going to curve in and blend in with the other lines where you want it to end. Just take your cues from the existing pattern shape. So where does it curve? Where does it taper in? How much does it increase and at certain points with each size change? If there is a flat side where there is no changes made for resizing on the pattern, then you're going to want to leave that side alone when you're doing your alterations. That side is going to stay straight. You're not going to add or subtract there. If you are making significant changes, then a mock-up is going to be a good way for you to test them out before applying them. So a mock-up is going to allow you to check your fit, figure out where alterations need to happen, or test alterations that you've made to your paper. It's a little more of a hands-on method, so if you prefer working with it, then working with your fabric rather than drawing it all in and calculating it, then this is a really good way to get to alterations. So a mock-up is just a copy of the garment that you're intending to make, and it's usually made out of a different fabric that you can then mark up and use as a new pattern. Muslin cloth is traditionally used for mock-ups, but you can use whatever you have available to you. Old bed sheets are good for this. The intent here is just to sew up the pattern in this extra cloth so you can then try it on and check the fit before you cut into the new fabric that you're intending to make your finished garment out of. This can be done really roughly. It doesn't have to look pretty. You don't need to finish the seams. You don't need to hem it. You just need to know if it's going to fit you. So you can try on your mock-up. If you notice areas that need adjustment, put it on inside out. So now you can pinch at seams and darts more easily if you need to take them in, pin up any excess, and draw on where you want new seams to go. So in my image here, I wanted to add some shaping to my tunic. So I've got it on inside out, and I've pinched in where I want the seam to go. I've pinned it, and I've marked it with chalk. So now I can sew this down and put this on and see how it fits. And if I don't like it, I can do the same thing again. I can put it on inside out and pinch and tuck more until it fits me to the point where I'm content with it. So with your mock-up, once you've done that, you've pinned everything, you've sewn it down, and you're happy with the fit, now you can take this whole thing apart, smooth out any crooked lines with your ruler, cut everything down to shape, so it is now the size that you want it to be. And now that is your new pattern. You are going to trace out your mock-up pieces to make your new garment. You can be confident that it's going to fit well because you have already tried it on. Okay, so slash and spread technique is a technique that I'm not particularly familiar with, but I did want to bring it up just so you could look into it later yourself if it is something that interests you. Slash and spreading involves making strategic cuts into your pattern paper to change the shape of it. So you can do this to resize a pattern. You can cut slits through it and just move everything out or bring it in to change the shape. Or you can do it to completely drastically change the shape of your pattern. If you've got a tight-fitting shirt, You can cut into it, space things out, and add a nice swing to the hem. But as I said, unfortunately, this is not a technique I'm very well versed in. So if this is something that sounds interesting to you, if you're interested in dramatically changing your patterns to customize them, then I would recommend looking up the slash and spread technique. There are a lot of tutorial videos available online. Okay, so this is the final technique I want to talk to you about, and it is pattern grading. Now this is a method for sizing up an existing pattern. So if the pattern you want was only available in a size 6 to 10, but you needed a 14, well, you can use this technique to size that 10 up to a 14. So what you're going to be doing is you're going to be drawing perpendicular lines through your size lines. So that's these yellow lines here is what I've done. Just drawn straight through those size lines. What you need to do is measure the space between the size lines along these lines you've drawn. If there is a you're measuring the space between these lines, and then you are increasing by that same amount. So if there is a 1/4 inch between each line here, then you are going to add an extra 1/4 inch along your line for every size that you are increasing by. So around curves where the thickness changes, just use more lines as reference points. And again, a curved ruler is really going to help you. It's really going to be an asset to smooth out your lines and get the correct shape. So here's my quick mock-up of what this is going to look like. So we've gone up 2 sizes. We've measured the differences here and added that same amount up 2 sizes and traced that out. Now, one of the more important details of this process I've marked in the red lines here. So your corners should always line up. You want to draw a line straight through those corners so they all line up. So that way when you are drawing your new size in, that is where your corners need to end. Same applies with notches. So your corners and your notches, just draw a line straight through those. And then in your new sizes, they should be in the correct place as long as you're following those lines. I found this to be a really helpful technique. I've started using this recently, especially when I'm making garments for other people and I don't have the correct size for them. I don't now have to go out and buy another copy of a pattern. I can just make these alterations to an existing pattern that I have to make sure it'll fit each individual person. And that's it. That's everything. We covered a lot of material, so I hope you found something new or interesting. Thank you so much for attending, and if you have any questions, please let me know in the chat. I'll be hanging around for a little while. Okay.
Amy, that was great. That was really well organized and flowed really well.
Thank you.
It has also enforced my feelings of I am not a sewer.
Yeah, it was a lot of information, so I'm glad that it came across as at least moderately coherent.
Yeah, I mean the parts that I was present for, it definitely made sense and it all flowed really nicely, and I'll probably continue to outsource for my sewing.
Okay, definitely. Yeah, I'm here if anyone has questions. I wish other people to join me in this sewing endeavor.
Yeah, it's funny. I've got the patience for chainmail, but I don't have the patience for sewing.
I mean, you can kind of get into a zen with your chainmail. You can just kind of sit and work on it with the At least with sewing, it takes up so much space, and you kind of have to be really attentive when you're cutting things.
Yeah, and the thing with chainmail too is that even if you make a mistake, no matter how annoying the mistake is, it's never permanent. You can undo it and redo it. Whereas, yeah, you make the wrong cut,
Yeah,
then if you make the cut like wrong enough, there's no salvaging.
I'm working on a hood right now, and I accidentally cut a hole in the side of the fabric because I got new sharp scissors just directly in the middle of this hood. So now I have to come up with a very clever way to hide this because I can't uncut that.
Oh no. A patch maybe?
Yeah, I'm gonna do some clever embroidery and hope it works.
Visible
Yeah.
mending.
Visible mending, exactly. Okay, well, I'm glad everyone stuck around, and I hope everyone had fun.
I definitely learned a lot. I mean, I was around for mostly the beginning of the class, but um if I ever do decide to go out and buy a pattern, at least now I'll have some idea as to what I'm looking at and what I need to know.
Good, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, it's just there's so much information. It's all just so tightly packed in there. So I figured it would help just to kind of go through and just even show, like, just point where you should be looking at. I figured would be helpful.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, thanks for having me to teach. This was an adventure. I've never taught before.
Well, thank you so much for doing it. You did great.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Lots of neat little things I didn't know, and like I put in the chat, like it explains a lot about why some of my projects have gone the way they did.
Oh,
So yeah, now I know where I went wrong with those ones with regards to the size and stuff. So now I know.
I'm so glad to hear that that was helpful.
I definitely prefer knitting, but I feel confident in basic sewing.
Oh, good.
So I don't think I'll be modifying any patterns anytime soon, but at least now I feel a little bit better about some of the more complex ones that I've been meaning to work on.
Yeah, I just wanted to be able to just to look at it and to be able to make some minor changes. Like, I didn't want to do anything too drastic, but just to help fit things a little nicer. Okay, well, I'm probably going to hang around chat for a little bit longer, but I think I'm going to go now and get my lunch and de-stress a little bit because this was very stressful, but very good.